Happy Friday, everyone. I'm Bandish, founder of The Curious Mindset, a private invitation-only community for technology leadership teams powered by 64 Tech, a technology provider across hardware, cloud, and IT services. While 64 Tech powers the platform, the real value of this community comes from the people in the room. Together, we are building a world where technology leaders lead better without having to figure it out alone. The Curious Mindset exists to help technology leaders become the best versions of themselves, because the hardest part of leadership is rarely the technology, it's the people. In a fast-moving world, many technology leaders are stuck in reactive mode, firefighting, buried in strategy decks, and chasing delivery. And somewhere in all that noise, the space to grow quietly disappears. That's why we built the Curious Mindset. This community brings together technology leadership teams and connects them with exceptional minds who share real perspectives on leadership. There are no membership fees and there are no intrusive sales methods, just human connection. A space to learn, connect, and grow through shared curiosity and honest conversations. Now, this community was born out of my own experiences. I know what it feels like to lead in isolation, and I don't want others to go through it alone. To give everybody a bit more context, particularly for anyone joining us today who's not been on the origin of the Curious Mindset session, this year marks 13 years since we incorporated 64 Tech. And in the early years, I took the business to the wall 3 times, not because of a lack of opportunity, but because I struggled with hiring, misunderstood behavior, and didn't understand leadership. The last part is still a work in progress. And those experiences forced me to rethink how we show up in the world. I redesigned the entire company around people. We stopped behaving like a technology provider and became a community-led one. Again, no sales, just human connection. And the reason I'm sharing this is simple. The Curious Mindset did not come from theory. It came from real mistakes and hard lessons, and from the belief that leadership is better when you're not figuring it out alone. And that's why 64 Tech's mantra is simple. Together we grow. We're a partner that helps leadership teams make confident decisions and deliver outcomes properly, not just by kit. Together we grow means we succeed when your environment, your people, and your strategy move forward, not when we ship a box. If you believe in what we're building, please stay connected and share it with others. This community grows through invitation and reputation, and it only works when we build it together. Our community is also on WhatsApp, making it even easier to stay connected and continue the conversation. Please do follow the link below or reach out to Bryony directly to be added. Now it's my pleasure to hand you over to my team working away in the background, our host, Andy McMenemy, our resident technology leader co-host, Steve Maxwell, and our very special guest, Dr. Katie Best. Thank you.
Manish, thank you so much for that introduction and for your continued support through 64 Tech. I know I say it every week, but this community could not exist without your generosity and the way that you sponsor and support every aspect of the Curious Mindset. So from the heart and from all of us, thank you so much for your continued support. It's fair to say, guys, that as leaders, as tech leaders, as leaders in businesses, challenges seem to be becoming more complex. Today, we're joined by Dr. Katie Best. Katie is an executive coach, a leadership expert, and a course convener at the London School of Economics. And Katie's going to be talking us through the subject matter of her book, the top 10 toughest challenges, the toughest leadership problems and how to solve them. And as leaders, it's important that we become innovators as well. And we're always looking for new, tried and tested methods that could help us to find those wins more efficiently and more effectively. And so to that end, I'd like to welcome Dr. Katie Best to the Curious Mindset. Katie, you're very welcome today. And I'm really curious to understand your take on how we solve the top 10 toughest problems, but also more curious to know how your solve framework can help us.
Awesome. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. It's such a pleasure to be here and see so many people on the call. So looking forward to having a conversation, looking forward to hearing everybody's questions. I think it's going to be a really good hour.
Thank you, Katie. So take it away. Tell us the background and your research and what you found fascinating about the top
Yeah,
10 toughest problems.
absolutely. So this book started during COVID. And I'm going to be very honest, it didn't start from the book idea. It started from me saying, I really want to write a book. What am I going to write a book about? And thinking about what came up regularly in the work that I was doing. So, as a leadership coach and consultant, every week I will hear new problems and new things coming from people. And I thought, shall I do a book on engagement? Shall I do a book on hybrid working? What should I be writing about? And then I realized that probably what I should be writing about was the problems themselves, all of those problems, and the method that until that point I'd kept in my head and that I was using in coaching sessions or in workshops that I was designing, and not really telling people about, just kind of assuming that no one needed to know that stuff. And I thought, what would happen if I kind of shared that model and turned that model into the basis for a book? And then that's how the book was born. And I'm very lucky. I live in Stoke Newington in North London, which is a neighbourhood replete with people who work in publishing. So I had lots of socially distanced coffees and walks with editors and ghostwriters and all sorts who all gave me advice about what might work in the market at the moment. And so the book was born, got an agent, got a publisher, and then in August this year, the book finally. And so, in choosing the 10 toughest problems, I started from the point of what do leaders talk to me about all the time and trying to divide that down to separate topics. And so, the list of topics, I'm going to go to the contents of the book because I can never, ever remember the 10 topics as much as I've tried. Is personal effectiveness is the first one, decision making, influence, individual performance. So that's how people on your team might perform, whether they perform well or badly. And if it's a problem, it's generally going to be that they're not performing how you need them to. Engagement or lack of it, teamwork, and the problems that crop up when you have teams, the conflict, when do they not gel, and how do you make sure that the sum of the parts is greater than the individual bits. And then a chapter on hybrid and remote working. So I'm going to come back to that in a second because that's quite an interesting one, why that's in there. Then delivering on the strategy. So I think the majority of leaders aren't working at the very top level. They're not necessarily in the C-suite. And actually coming up with the strategy often isn't that difficult. It's the how you take the strategy and translate it for your team and feed it in, down, and through the organization that is the problem, and demonstrating that your function is working in line with that strategy. Then problem 9 is culture and values. How do you make sure you're aligned to the culture? What happens if you or your team members aren't? How do you make someone fall back in love with the values of the organization? And then finally, leading change. The reason I said I'll come back to hybrid is because I'd got the 9 chapters, hadn't got that one, and then wanted to crowdsource the 10th chapter. And maybe as a result of it being during COVID and hybrid working suddenly being at the top of everyone's attention, hybrid and remote working came up strongly as the favourite in terms of whether I should include it. But my publisher, the editor, was really not keen on this and said, I think it's just, a flash in the pan. I'm not sure that that's going to actually be something that's going to resonate in 4 or 5 years' time. What I would actually say is it's become an even bigger problem because people thought it would go away, and because now there's an expectation from teams that they'll be home working, but it doesn't necessarily always work for either their mental health or the organization. Leaders are in a really difficult position as to how much home working to allow, how much not to allow, and then how do you make teams gel who are some of them in the office, some of them at home. And then just one more thing to say on that is in each chapter, it's organized around the solve method. And that's the method that I was talking about, that I was using with team members, with coaches that I was with leaders I was working with as a coach, or team members in workshops. And it's an acronym, so SOLVE. I'm just going to pause for a second. Andy, are you happy with me just carrying on going and talking about solve?
Absolutely. I'm fascinated.
Perfect. Okay. So the S stands for state your problem. So stage number 1, you've got a problem. It's all muddled in your head. It's like a big bird's nest, loads of factors, really complex, trying to unpick it. I think the first thing you need to do is write that problem down in a really succinct way. So when you receive your copy of the book, you'll see on each chapter, the first section, set out your problem or state your problem. It's got a very short description of what you might use in that section. So for example, my team members are really struggling with engagement and it's having an effect on the bottom line. So what's the problem in short, and what's the consequence? And at this point, you need to avoid coming up with reasons why. We're not onto reasons why yet. It's literally what you're observing. And also, we're not on the stage of actually being able to solve the problem. So we don't want solutions in there. It's just stating the problem and what the consequences as you currently observe them are. Second letter O, open the box. So once you've got your problem statement, this is where you really start to dig in more detail into the problem. And I think there's two main ways of doing this. One is first-hand research. So that's observing your team members or wherever the problem is, asking questions, doing surveys, whatever kind of first-hand data you can physically go out and gather to try and make sense of the problem. So if, for example, you have a team member who's underperforming, how can you go and find out why that might be happening and to try and understand it more? You might ask them, you might ask other people who's worked with them, you might look at the data that's been generated on their work to see if you can unpick where the problem lies. So all sorts of first-hand research you can do. The other kind of research that you can do at the open the box stage is you can look at what's already been written on this subject. So if you've got a team member who's underperforming, go and have a look at what's been written about why people underperform. Sometimes it might be a values issue. They might be feeling disengaged. They might not know how to do the job. There'll be loads of really good content out there which will help you to try and unpick and understand that. And one resource that I think is really underutilized in the workplace is Harvard Business Review. I really think they should be paying me for all of the times that I promote it, but I think, yeah, I definitely don't think they need to. They've got a huge audience that reads it, but you get a certain amount of articles for free every month. So I think people should be using that very heavily, looking up what has been written about performance, what's been written about underperformance, and so forth. And then other resources like that. There's plenty of others out there too. Then we get onto the L, which is the lay out your solution stage. So you've looked at the problem, you've set it out, you've tried to work out what might be causing it, and then you're going to lay out the solution. So what do you think you need to do to deal with each of the causes of the problem to reduce the problem or to get it to go away? So if you did your research and you found that the reason that someone was underperforming was because they didn't know properly how to do their job, they'd not been properly trained, then a very obvious thing to include in lay out your solution would be training that team member. I make that sound very straightforward. Often bad performance and the fact that someone doesn't know what they're doing hides in plain sight. It's much more common than we would expect, but very well hidden. So in the lay out your solution stage, again, you might be asking questions about what could help, doing some observation, doing some research, as well as using all that stuff you found in Harvard Business Review or the Financial Times, or wherever else you've looked, about what tends to help in these sorts of situations. Then we go on to the V stage, which is venture forth with an exclamation mark at the end. And the exclamation mark definitely intended, with the idea being that once you've got your solution, you just need to go ahead and have a go at applying it. Some leaders will sit there with it and go, yeah, I've got a solution, but be too scared to act. And it's very important that you take action. And while you're doing that, remembering stuff could go wrong, you might need to pivot, you need to be flexible about the obstacles that you might encounter and how to get around those, but you've got to go ahead and try and put a solution into place. And then the final letter is E, elevate your learning. And this is where I feel this model's got something really significant to give, because you've learned a new skill set. You've learned how to engage someone who isn't performing, or you've learned how to lead change better. You don't just want to put that skill set back in the drawer and not use it again. You want to be able to continue to use it. So you might do all sorts of things. You might try and teach it to somebody else. You might just have discovered a real passion for coaching someone through a difficult situation. You might go and do some coach training. You might offer your services out to other people in the organization who need help unpicking what's going on with performance, and so forth. There's lots of other ways that you can continue to elevate and use your learning once you've dealt with the original problem.
Katie, I love a framework, and that is so succinct, and it's so natural to follow those steps. For me, it feels, something that I could adopt very easily. I'm conscious that within our community, the Curious Mindset, we have some very, very experienced leaders and some that are new to the leadership journey. But also on top of that, some of them have very diverse teams, across Europe, Middle East and Africa, America, Canada, etc. And of course, in the workplace, we've got so many different age groups now. Have you found any commonalities in your research that helps to navigate that part of management?
Yeah, so a quick point on that is one of the reasons I wanted to create a model to help solve problems rather than telling someone the right thing to do is I think context is so important. And as soon as we start to propose solutions without really understanding someone's context, we're probably going to get it wrong, because things like age, culture, type of organization you're working in, industry, function, all of those things will really shape what works as a good solution. So as someone's using the model, they need to think about that context too. In terms of the age difference and the generational stuff, I think it gets overplayed quite a lot, which I think is a shame, because I think it gives people an excuse who are potentially older and more senior in an organisation to just say, well, those new people who are in the lower positions haven't got a clue about the world that we're operating in, and they're lazy and they don't want to do the work and they just want loads of feedback. Whereas if we're honest, we're probably all a bit like that when we started work. It might be slightly more pronounced, but when you look at the data, differences are really small, and then the researchers blow up those differences because it sells books, whereas we're talking about a couple of percentage points difference very often. So I think it's important not to overplay it, and rather to look at people as though they're individuals and try and understand what their motivations, their hopes, their fears are. And yeah, you could maybe use their generation as a slight clue, in the same way that we might use their country culture as a slight clue, but we wouldn't just want to assume that everyone from one country had a particular type of personality. We can see how short-sighted that would be, and I think it's the same with generations.
I think that's a great point. But also, when we think about it from a leadership perspective, or managing a team perspective, then all we're really holding them accountable for, I would imagine, are the standards that we have in the business. And for them to deliver the competencies they say they have in their CV, which either got them the job in the first place, right? If we recruited them, or that they've grown into that role.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we also need to be quite kind to people. I think there can be a real kind of hostility around the different generations, or someone because they're different to us and they don't understand, and they want more than we're prepared to give as managers. It might just be a case that they need a bit more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone else in a similar situation to them is going to need a bit more as well. It all tends to balance each other out.
So I'm curious, were there any surprises for you in doing that research? Did anything come out of the woodwork that you thought, I didn't think of that?
I think I was very surprised, but this isn't specific to the book. This is, I've been long-term surprised, is how often senior or mid to senior leaders will come up to me and go, I'm not very good at delegation, or my personal effectiveness is absolutely terrible, but don't tell anyone because everyone at this position is supposed to be good at this. And you're like, no, there's so many other people in mid to senior level leadership whose personal effectiveness is appalling, and whose ability on these things like delegation isn't great. So very often when I run workshops, I shoehorn in delegation in a way that I don't call it delegation, I'll call it something else. But it's the bit where everyone starts taking ferocious notes. So recognizing that piece about personal effectiveness and how you need to give up some work, or you will probably go mad. It surprises me in the sense that people are embarrassed that they don't have it, and that it's not something that comes naturally to everybody.
It's probably where a lot of imposter syndrome creeps in, because it's a subject we've covered many times in the past amongst the team and the Curious Mindset and the speakers, because it seems to come up in business an awful lot, which is probably relevant to what you're saying there. People have grown through their positions. They seem to be pedaling fast underneath the surface, but everything seems to be smooth and calm on top.
Yeah, definitely. We expect so much of leaders to just have the right answers and to be always on and role models for perfection. But I think actually often those expectations come from us as leaders rather than from other people. And we just put so much pressure on ourselves to be some version of perfect that is unsustainable. And a bit of self-kindness, I think, is really important. There's a lot of self-kindness in this book. It's definitely not about leaders beating themselves really hard because they can't squeeze an extra hour out of their day. It's about saying, actually, you've got to look after yourself in the long term, which involves sometimes looking after yourself in the short term. You can't do 15-hour days, or, or 12-hour, whatever feels uncomfortable for you as a human being. You can't push yourself to that level of discomfort day in, day out and not expect it to catch up with you.
Yeah, we're all human, Katie. You're absolutely right. And I wonder where you sit on the subject of vulnerability then as a leader, admitting that perhaps sometimes, you don't have the answer, or sometimes that you are feeling the stress and the strain, right?
Yeah, I think it's all of that is good to an extent. So the research now definitely shows that team members want leaders who are not perfect and who don't profess to have all of the answers all of the time. Having some vulnerability makes us appear much more human and makes our team members much more likely to follow our leadership because they see us as being a 360-degree human being rather than a robot. I think we have to be a little bit careful with vulnerability, that we don't overplay it, because it works when you use it sometimes. But if you were a leader who showed up to every meeting going, well, guys, I don't know the answers, and let's figure it out together, people would start to question what exactly you're being paid for. So it's a really useful tool in the leadership toolkit, but one to be used with care. I think also vulnerability is something where if you're vulnerable because you're feeling upset or afraid, you definitely don't want to pass that vulnerability on either. You need to hold that, a bit of that yourself, to allow your team to do their jobs and not feel as though they are your therapist.
That's fascinating, because it's definitely a case that I know in my own coaching, I've come across many scenarios like that. So thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. And where do you stand on, I guess, delegation when it comes to delegating? Because it is an area that leaders have to get comfortable with. We only have so much time in a day, and we have our own demands and our own responsibilities. So when it comes to delegating, what have you learned, and what have you identified through the solve process of being able to delegate effectively?
Yeah. So I think people often hang on to work for two main reasons. The first reason is they feel guilty passing it on to their team. The second reason is that they don't want to give up all the work and then feel like they're just a middle or senior manager and then put themselves at risk of obsolescence or redundancy. And on the first point, you've got to give up work to your team because you are being paid a much higher rate by the hour if you work it out on an hourly rate than your team is. And so if the work can be done by someone who's cheaper, then it should be done by someone who's cheaper. Otherwise, you're not good value for your organization at all. In terms of hoarding the work, if you're not developing your team and letting other people have a piece of that work, firstly, you're going to disengage them, and then secondly, you're going to burn yourself out. So I think there are such good reasons for delegation, but then it's also about having the skill of how to do it. And I think the key things that leaders often forget, they forget to explain to someone why they're delegating a task to them. And so the person's like, this is rubbish, this is boring, or I'm switched off, or whatever. But linking it through to the organization's strategy and showing why it's mission critical, even if it's a bit of a stretch, it's really important. Exactly as Kevin just said on the chat, start with why. Yes, why is it that you're doing it? um yeah, I realise I'm then stealing someone else's idea. Thank you, Simon Sinek. However, it's a good point. That's why he makes that point and managed to write a whole book about it. And then the other thing is making sure that you do the right level of checking in with people around the task. So if they're not capable of you completely going hands off, don't. Similarly, if they don't need you involved at every stage, don't be. Getting the right distance between yourself as the leader and them doing the task will really help your delegation skills as well.
And I like the fact that when you said, open the box, and then you mentioned specifically, Harvard Business Review. Well, there are loads of great models out there on, effective delegation and how to delegate. And I guess it links seamlessly into your final E on the solve framework, which is to then elevate your learning, isn't it? Is to find ways to elevate your ability to delegate.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we only have so much time and we only have so much ability to focus. So it's really important. But I think the why is really good, because it puts the importance on the person that we're delegating to, and also the accountability for that responsibility, right?
Yeah, exactly. And people want to feel important. That's just inherent to how we are at work. We don't want our work to feel boring. We want it to feel like it matters both to ourselves and to the organization in general. And so delegation needs to answer to both of those questions. And in the book, thinking about leadership problems, where delegation is one that really kicks in for leaders when they kind of get to the mid-level and they realize they can't avoid delegating anymore. Similarly, something like leading their team and a team that are in conflict, when you realize, oh wow, this is suddenly my responsibility to have to handle these warring parties, that's another big wake-up call for people at the middle of their career.
And where have you found that people do that most effectively? Who are the examples you would point us to as people that excel in those areas that from your research?
Yeah, so high emotional intelligence, and it's such a boring thing to say because it's like, yeah, I know, okay, I've got to be good at reading other people, I've got to be good at reading myself, moderating my behavior, moderating their behavior. But they are the fundamental things where so much of leadership comes down to good emotional intelligence. And if that doesn't come naturally to you, then you need to adopt habits that stop you in your tracks and force you to find that information out. So if you're not someone who senses the mood in the room, then you've got to proactively go and find that data, ask people questions about how things are going, to check in with what's the situation, who's getting on with who, where is their tension. So you can be really successful even if your emotional intelligence isn't so high, as long as you routinize that information searching to gain that information that you might gain more naturally if you had high emotional intelligence.
And that's a really good point, actually. And that's just reminded me of a case study with Harvard Business School with Dr. Amy Edmondson,
Yeah.
who links that seamlessly with creating an environment of psychological safety
Yes.
in the team. And I think she did a lot of work studying Google on that. Is
Yeah.
that something that is becoming more prevalent now?
I think it's a term that people understand a lot more, which I think then shows that people are taking it more seriously. So a few years ago, if I'd have said psychological safety in a workshop, I'd have had to then explain what psychological safety is. Now you say it, people generally nod. If they've been in leadership for a while, people get what that idea means. I think the most simple definition I like, I think, came from Amy Edmondson, which is you feel prepared to take risks and make mistakes in front of other people. And boiling it down to that is a really good litmus test of whether you've got psychology on the team. She, for everyone here, she did such an interesting piece of research, which you probably already know, Andy, but where she looked at surgical teams and found that the surgical teams with the highest psychological safety made the most mistakes. And she was like, this is so terrible. This is going to ruin all my research on psychological safety. I'm gutted. And then she realized it's just because the teams with psychological safety were reporting the mistakes. And so then if you compared those two teams over a period of time, the ones with psychological safety who were reporting their mistakes, their mistake incidents went down. The teams that didn't have psychological safety, who weren't reporting as many mistakes, it stayed consistent. So you would assume that in the background, the same number of mistakes is being made. And I think that is such a good advert for why we should encourage that bravery of saying I've done something wrong, and why even as a leader, it's also really brave to say to a team member, it's okay, I've got your back. I know you've made a mistake. We're going to learn from that. I've got your back, because you're potentially going to get in the firing line for the mistake that team member's made. But if you want that psychological safety, it's going to be worth it.
And I guess as long as we can apply the critical debrief process so that we learn from the mistake and we learn from the, not necessarily who made the mistake, but where did the process break down?
Yeah,
then
exactly.
we can then apply that focus, can't we?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, recognizing how you go about doing that. So my favorite podcast is The Rest is Entertainment. I don't know if anyone else listens to it, with Richard Osman and Marina Hyde. I mean, it's very outside the scope of what we're talking about, but I love it. And Marina was yesterday in the episode was talking about how her kids at school are taught the same principles as a learning organization at school. So the idea that we make mistakes and we learn from them, and how that's being embedded even at preschool age. And that really is such a good foundation for psychological safety. So one might hope that as that comes up with the younger generations into the workplace and they become managers and leaders, they've got a good grounding in how to do those things.
With the top 10 problems, then, do you find, Katie, that they stay in that hierarchy, or do you find that they, maybe number 5 becomes number 1? And what causes them to
Yeah.
shift?
So I intentionally didn't do that research for the book. I wanted it to be about the things that I'd experienced in my work, and so the problems that I could write to the most confidently. Subsequent to writing the book, I did then go out and ask leaders, if you were going to rank these problems, where would you put them? What was really interesting was they put decision making right at the bottom, and they also put their ability to lead other people right at the bottom. Now, that's definitely, if you ask the people who they're managed, who they manage, bet you that they don't think that the least of the problems is how they're leading. Considering so many people are unhappy with who they're managed or led by, it seems like a really interesting disjoint between the reality and their perception. So it's in a sense, it's a really difficult thing to measure, because who do you ask? Do you ask the leaders? Do you ask their team members? Do you ask society at large? I'm not sure.
So it's piquing a question in me that having written the book now, is there an evolution of that coming?
I mean, it seems mad, doesn't it, that there's nothing in there about AI, but then writing it 2 years ago, or, in fact, I didn't even finish writing it 2 years ago. I finished writing it 14, 15 months ago. How on earth can AI not be in there? But it's just, and I'm aware that I'm speaking to a group of people who are probably much more literate on this than I am. But if I were to rewrite the book, it would have to find its way in there somehow. I'm sure it's not a separate chapter, but there might, the chapter on leading change, potentially there would be a very large bit of boxed text around leading through the uncertainty that AI causes. And similarly with personal effectiveness, something around the seduction of AI doing your work, and when is the right time to let it and when is not. How can you avoid work slop while it also speeds you up?
That's a great point, because AI is prevalent now, isn't it? And in the
Yeah,
last years, even more so. And I guess one of the biggest challenges our tech leaders would face would be
yeah,
the threat of cyber attacks and system
yeah.
failures as a result of that. So I'm fairly sure there. But then, having said that, though, the Solve framework would equally apply to how they approach that.
Exactly. Yeah, so there's
So
no reason why it can't be applied to that. And in fact, I'm running a course now online where people can sign up for it, and you can do the Solve model with me coaching you. And AI is a big problem, So of the 8 or 10 people in the early bird group, 2 of them have got problems that specifically relate to AI that they're talking about. So yeah, it's definitely a model that works for it, even if it's not directly in the book.
it's just a way of navigating the challenge, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, Katie, I'm conscious we're 5 minutes out from handing over to our resident tech leader, Steve, who's going to be fielding some questions. I'm just wondering what you'd like to leave us with as far as thoughts with the book. I know we're all going to receive a copy of the book, but what
Yeah.
would you give us as thought processes to think about when we're reading the book and when we're applying it?
I think the most powerful way of reading the book isn't feeling like you have to read it like in the order that it's written. Read the introduction, pick out the chapters that resonate for you and where you are right now, and then read the final chapter, which is about how to use Solve to deal with any other problem that you've got. And then treat it as a resource where if anything comes up, you can just go and get the book back off your bookshelf, look at that problem, and see whether it's got something to give you in relation to that problem. I also write a newsletter, which is Dear Katie, where people write into me with their real leadership problems. So maybe we'll get the team to share the link to that if anyone wants to sign up to it afterwards. So if you do come up with a problem when you're reading it and you think, well, I could run it through the Solve model, but there's not a chapter here on it, write to me. Like, I'd love to hear what you're stuck on, and that maybe even then features in a future edition of the book.
Excellent. Katie, thank you so much. I'm
Thank
going to
you.
ask Steve to come forward now, because I know Steve will have a ton of questions of his own, not only those that he's going to field from the community. But Katie, thank you so much. I so look forward to reading your book. Thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
those insights with us. And I'm going to hand you over to Steve. Steve?
Perfect. Thanks, Andy.